Alexander Knight was a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the business world. As the CEO of Knight Industries, his empire spanned technology, real estate, and finance, and his decisions could ripple through markets and industries with unmatched precision. His wealth was legendary, his success unparalleled, but his reputation was as cold and calculating as the towering skyscraper that bore his company's name. The Knight Tower stood as a monument to Alexander's vision, a gleaming glass and steel edifice piercing the clouds, visible from nearly every point in the city. Its design was modern yet imposing, with sharp angles and sleek lines that mirrored the personality of its owner. Inside, the building was a hive of activity, with employees moving purposefully through its polished halls, their movements choreographed like clockwork to meet the demands of a man known for his exacting standards. But for all its grandeur, Knight Tower was as much a fortress as it was a symbol of success. Few people dared to approach Alexander unless summoned, and even fewer were allowed into the inner sanctum of his top-floor office, a space that was both minimalist and luxurious, designed to intimidate as much as to inspire. Alexander's personal life, however, was a stark contrast to his public persona. While his empire flourished, his heart remained locked behind walls of his own making. Losses early in life, ones he refused to discuss, had shaped him into a man who valued control above all else. He thrived in environments where logic reigned supreme and emotion was a liability. Relationships were transactions, and trust was a commodity he rarely traded. His penthouse atop Knight Tower mirrored this philosophy. The sprawling space was a marvel of modern architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. Yet its interiors were cold and impersonal, filled with designer furniture that seemed untouched and walls adorned with art, chosen for its value rather than sentiment. The laughter of friends or family had long since been replaced by the hum of silence, broken only by the occasional clink of glass or the distant murmur of the city below. Alexander had made peace with his solitude, or so he thought. He had no need for distractions. His work was his purpose, his empire, his legacy. But that carefully maintained equilibrium was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't foresee. Clara Evans stood outside the Knight Tower, clutching her worn leather portfolio as she gazed up at the massive building. The towering structure seemed to mock her modest appearance, a second-hand blazer, scuffed flats, and a blouse that had seen better days. Clara had always been resourceful, making do with what she had, but standing at the threshold of Knight Industries made her acutely aware of the gulf between her world and Alexander Knight's. She took a deep breath, summoning the courage that had carried her through countless hardships. This wasn't just a job interview, it was a chance to rewrite her story, to climb out of the endless cycle of struggle and uncertainty that had defined her life. Clara had spent years working odd jobs from waitressing to temp work, all while caring for her ailing mother. Her resume was far from polished, but it told a story of resilience, adaptability, and a work ethic that wouldn't quit. Stepping into the building, Clara was immediately struck by its opulence. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern design, with marble floors so reflective they seemed to stretch into infinity, and an intricate chandelier casting a soft, golden glow. The air was cool and faintly scented with something expensive and unplaceable. Everywhere she looked, employees in tailored suits moved with purpose, their polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. Clara felt out of place, but she refused to let it show. She squared her shoulders and approached the receptionist, who greeted her with the same detached professionalism that seemed to permeate the building. After verifying her appointment, Clara was directed to the top floor. Alexander was not a man who conducted interviews personally, but Clara's application had caught his attention. It wasn't her credentials. Those were unremarkable by his standards. But the tone of her cover letter. While others tried to dazzle him with accolades and platitudes, Clara's words had been raw and honest. She didn't claim to be perfect or exceptional. She promised to work harder than anyone else in the room. That kind of sincerity was rare, and Alexander was intrigued. When Clara stepped into his office, her breath hitched. The space was even more intimidating than she'd imagined. The walls were lined with sleek bookshelves, each perfectly curated, and the large windows behind Alexander's desk offered a dizzying view of the city. Alexander himself sat at the center of it all, his presence commanding and immovable. His sharp blue eyes met hers, assessing her with a precision that made her feel as though he could see straight through her. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice deep and even, "take a seat." Clara obeyed, her grip tightening on her portfolio. The chair beneath her was impossibly soft, but her nerves made it impossible to relax. Alexander studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You're not what I expected." Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I get that a lot." His lips quirked slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though amused by her response. "Your resume is unconventional, to say the least. Why do you think you're suited for this role?" Clara took a deep breath. "Because I know how to adapt, how to solve problems, and how to make things work under pressure. I've had to, my whole life." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Bold words. Can you back them up? For the next hour, Clara answered his questions with a mix of honesty and determination. She didn't try to embellish her experience or downplay her shortcomings. Instead, she focused on her ability to learn quickly and her willingness to put in the effort others wouldn't. By the end of the interview, her nerves had settled, replaced by a quiet confidence that surprised even her. When Alexander finally spoke again, his tone was measured. "You're rough around the edges, but I don't have time for perfection. I need someone who can handle chaos and still deliver results. The job is yours on a trial basis." Relief washed over Clara, but she kept her composure, nodding politely. "Thank you, Mr. Knight. I won't let you down." Over the next few weeks, Clara threw herself into her new role. Alexander's demands were relentless, his standards unforgiving, but Clara adapted quickly. She learned to anticipate his needs, streamline his chaotic schedule, and manage the whirlwind of meetings and projects that defined his days. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Slowly, Alexander began to trust her, granting her responsibilities he had never delegated before. But as Clara settled into her position, she couldn't ignore the weight of the secret she carried. Her job wasn't just a means to an end, it was part of a carefully calculated plan. Alexander Knight wasn't just her boss, he was the key to uncovering a truth that had haunted her for years. And as she grew closer to him, the lines between her mission and her emotions began to blur. For his part, Alexander found himself drawn to Clara in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her resilience, her quick wit, and her unflinching honesty challenged him in ways few people dared. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. The unspoken tension between them grew with each passing day, setting the stage for a revelation that would change both their lives forever. The rhythm of Clara Evans' new role at Knight Industries was relentless. As Alexander Knight's personal secretary, her days were consumed by tightly scheduled meetings, endless calls, and last-minute crises that required razor-sharp precision to resolve. The gleaming office on the top floor of Knight Tower became her second home, its polished surfaces and sterile decor a stark contrast to the warmth and chaos she'd grown up with. Yet, despite the demands of the job, Clara found herself thriving. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of her hidden agenda began to grow heavier. Clara hadn't come to Knight Industries by chance. She had sought this position deliberately, driven by a need for answers that only Alexander Knight could provide. It wasn't about the paycheck or the prestige, though both were a godsend for someone in her position. It was about uncovering the truth about her past, a truth that Alexander unknowingly held. Alexander was a man of few words, but Clara quickly learned to read between the lines of his sharp commands and clipped emails. His precision extended to everything he did. Meetings ran exactly on time, deals were negotiated with ruthless efficiency, and he rarely left a task unfinished. Yet, as she worked closer with him, she noticed cracks in his icy demeanor. Late nights in the office revealed moments of quiet reflection, fleeting glimpses of a man weighed down by more than corporate responsibilities. One evening, after the last of the day's meetings had ended, Clara sat at her desk outside Alexander's office, organizing the following week's calendar. The muffled hum of the city below filled the silence, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the room. Just as she was about to leave, Alexander's voice broke the quiet. "Clara." She turned, startled to see him standing in the doorway of his office. He looked uncharacteristically casual, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. For a moment, he simply studied her, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as though trying to solve a puzzle. "Come in," he said finally. Clara followed him into the office, her heart pounding. She had grown accustomed to his intensity, but this felt different, more personal. Alexander gestured for her to sit as he leaned against the edge of his desk, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. "You've been here long enough to know how things work," he began, his tone measured. "You've done well. Better than I expected." Clara blinked, taken aback by the rare compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Knight. I appreciate that." He nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "But I can't help but wonder, what drives someone like you? You're not here for the money or the title. So what is it?" Clara froze. The question hit too close to the truth, and for a moment she struggled to compose herself. I just want to prove myself," she said carefully. "To show that I'm capable of more than people assume." Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded as though accepting her answer, though his gaze suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Fair enough," he said, straightening. "But remember this. In my world, everyone has an agenda. Trust is earned, not given. Don't make me regret trusting you." Clara's chest tightened. "I won't." As the weeks went on, the tension between them grew, not the tension of distrust, but of unspoken curiosity. Alexander found himself drawn to Clara in ways he couldn't explain. She was efficient, yes, but there was something else about her. A fire, a quiet strength that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. For a man who had built his life around control, this feeling of intrigue was unsettling. Clara, too, felt the pull. Working alongside Alexander meant seeing past his intimidating reputation to the man beneath, a man driven by grief and ambition, whose guarded nature masked a deep well of pain. But as her admiration for him grew, so did her guilt. She couldn't forget why she was here, or the secret she carried. One night, as the city's lights glittered outside the office windows, Clara stumbled upon something that deepened the mystery surrounding Alexander. She had been tasked with organizing old files in preparation for a major board meeting. Among the neatly labeled folders, she found one that stood out, a personal file labeled Havenhurst. Clara hesitated, her curiosity warring with her sense of propriety. Finally, unable to resist, she opened the file. Inside were photographs of a sprawling estate surrounded by lush greenery. The house was beautiful but had an air of abandonment, its once pristine facade now weathered and worn. Beneath the photos were documents, property records, financial reports, and handwritten notes in Alexander's precise script. One note caught her attention. Havenhurst, closed after the accident. No visitors, no inquiries. Clara's brow furrowed. What accident? And why would Alexander keep such a file in his otherwise meticulous records? She quickly closed the folder and returned it to its place, but the questions lingered. Was this connected to the truth she was seeking? Or was it another layer of the mystery surrounding Alexander? The following day, Clara couldn't shake the unease from her discovery. She wanted to ask Alexander about Havenhurst, but she knew better than to pry. He was a man who guarded his secrets fiercely, and she couldn't risk jeopardizing the fragile trust they had built. Her answer came sooner than expected. During a quiet moment in the office, Alexander caught her staring out the window, her expression distant. "You're distracted," he said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Clara turned to him, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Alexander's gaze sharpened. "Havenhurst." Her breath caught. "What?" "The file," he said, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "I know you found it. You're not as subtle as you think." Clara's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Knight. I didn't mean to overstep." Alexander's expression softened, though his eyes remained guarded. Havenhurst was my family's estate, he said quietly. We lost it after the accident. It's not something I talk about. Clara hesitated, then asked, "What happened?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "That's a story for another time. Right now we have work to do." The conversation ended, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Havenhurst was the key to unraveling the truth. Not just about Alexander, but a bow. The secret she carried was tied to that place, and the closer she got to Alexander, the more certain she became that her revelation would change everything. The discovery of the Havenhurst file had shattered Clara Evans' resolve to remain distant. That name, Havenhurst, wasn't just a detail. It was the missing thread that tied together her purpose for being here and Alexander Knight's hidden past. For weeks, Clara had buried herself in work, keeping her secret locked inside her heart. But the weight of the truth was growing unbearable, and she could sense it coming to a head. Alexander, too, had grown quieter, more pensive. His usual cold demeanor had started to show cracks, moments where his mask slipped just enough to reveal the man underneath, one haunted by old memories and the burden of loss. His questions, though subtle, revealed his growing suspicion that Clara wasn't exactly who she claimed to be. And yet, despite his razor-sharp instincts, he hadn't yet confronted her, until now. The evening the truth began to unravel was like any other, or so it seemed. The office lights were dim, casting long shadows across the pristine furniture as Clara sorted through reports at her desk. The world outside Knight Tower was dark, the city's skyline glittering through the massive glass windows. It had become routine for Clara to stay late, far past the time most employees had gone home, and she found an odd comfort in the stillness. Her focus was shattered by the sudden sound of Alexander's voice. "Clara," he said, his tone low but firm. Clara froze, her hand tightening around the stack of papers she was organizing. She turned to find him standing in the doorway of his office, his figure silhouetted against the dim interior. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, a rare disarming sight that made her pulse quicken. But there was something else about him tonight. An intensity in his gaze. A finality. "Come into my office," he said simply. Clara's heart pounded as she followed him inside. The heavy wooden doors closed with a faint thud behind her, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Alexander moved to stand by the window, his silhouette framed by the glow of the city lights. He said nothing at first, simply staring out at the skyline as though lost in thought. Finally, he turned to face her, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "You've been here long enough, Clara," he began, his voice even but edged with something unspoken. "Long enough for me to know when someone isn't telling me the full story." Clara's throat went dry. She tried to steady herself, clutching her hands together. "What do you mean?" Alexander took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "Havenhurst." The word hit her like a thunderclap. Her knees nearly gave out, but she managed to stay on her feet. "Havenhurst?" she echoed faintly as though she hadn't heard him properly. "Yes," Alexander said, his voice quieter now but far more dangerous. "You found the file. I let it slide because I assumed it was curiosity. An employee snooping where she shouldn't. But this isn't curiosity, is it? It's something more." Clara felt her heart hammering in her chest, her mind racing for a way out of this. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alexander's jaw tightened, his expression turning cold. "Don't lie to me. You're hiding something, Clara, and I'm done waiting for you to come clean." She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. The truth she had tried so hard to conceal was now clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be spoken. Alexander didn't take his eyes off her as he moved to the desk and opened the Havenhurst file, spreading its contents across the dark mahogany surface. "This estate," he said, gesturing to the faded photographs of the once grand house. "This tragedy, this accident, it's something I buried years ago. But you're here for a reason. So tell me, Clara, what is it? What do you want from me?" Clara felt her chest tighten as the moment she dreaded finally arrived. She couldn't keep it hidden any longer. The truth was clawing at her throat, desperate to be spoken. "I'm not who you think I am," she said softly, her voice trembling. Alexander's expression darkened. "What does that mean?" Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment, summoning the courage she needed. When she looked up, her green eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. "My mother," she began. "My mother's name was Isabel Knight." For the first time, Alexander froze. The color drained from his face, and for a moment, he looked as though she had struck him. "What did you say?" he whispered. Clara swallowed hard. "Isabel Knight, she was your sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stared at her, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly racing as he processed her words. The name Isabel Knight was like a ghost in the room, one he had spent years trying to forget. "She was my mother," Clara continued, her voice steadier now. "After the accident at Havenhurst, after everything fell apart, she left. She never told me the full story, only that we had to disappear. She raised me alone, far away from all of this. I didn't even know about you until I found this." She gestured toward the file on the desk, her hands trembling. Alexander took a step back, as though the weight of her words was too much to bear. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not," Clara replied firmly. "I came here because I needed answers. I needed to understand why my mother left, why she kept me from you. And now I see why. Because Havenhurst wasn't just an accident, was it?" Alexander turned away, his hands clenching into fists as he braced himself against the edge of the desk. His breathing was ragged, his shoulders tense as the ghosts of his past came crashing back. "Havenhurst was the end of everything," he said finally, his voice low and broken. "My sister, Isabel, she blamed me for what happened, and maybe she was right." Clara felt her heart ache as she watched him, this man who had always seemed so unshakable now unraveling before her eyes. She had come here for answers, but she hadn't expected to find this, a man burdened by guilt, grief, and the weight of a past he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. "I didn't come here to hurt you," Clara said softly, stepping closer. "I just wanted to know the truth." Alexander turned to face her, his blue eyes filled with pain. "And now you know." The two of them stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a past neither could escape. The truth was finally out, and it had changed everything. Alexander Knight, the man she had once feared and admired, was not just her boss. He was her family. And for the first time in years, the walls he had built around his heart began to crack. But the truth was only the beginning. What lay ahead for both of them was far more dangerous than either of them realized. The revelation of Clara's identity had shattered the delicate balance that existed between her and Alexander. The truth, that she was Isabel Knight's daughter, Alexander's niece, was now out in the open, and it hung between them like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. For years, Alexander had buried Havenhurst, his family, and the tragedy that had defined his life. And now standing before him was the living embodiment of the past he had tried so hard to forget. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Alexander withdrew into himself, speaking to Clara only when necessary. The once fluid rhythm of their working relationship was gone, replaced by tension and unspoken words. Clara tried to focus on her tasks, but the weight of the revelation gnawed at her, as did the uncertainty of what would happen next. She had hoped the truth would bring clarity, perhaps even healing, but instead it had created a chasm between them that she wasn't sure could be bridged. One evening, Clara sat alone at her desk long after the rest of the office had emptied. The skyline outside was dark, the lights of the city below reflecting in the glass like 1,000 unspoken secrets. Her hands hovered over her keyboard as she stared blankly at the glowing screen. Her mind drifted to her mother, Isabel, and the stories that were never told. She remembered the way her mother would look at old photographs, her eyes filled with sadness she never explained. Clara had grown up in a house without answers, where questions about their past were met with silence. Now, standing at the precipice of the truth, she realized that the answers she had sought might hurt more than the questions ever did. The sound of footsteps startled her. She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway of his office, his silhouette backlit by the dim lights inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked different, tired, his sharp edges softened by a weariness Clara hadn't seen before. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There's work to finish." Alexander didn't move. He studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "You don't have to keep doing this. You've already given me what I wanted. Answers." Clara felt a pang in her chest. "Is that all I am to you? Answers?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander's expression flickered, a flash of something deeper passing across his face before his usual stoic mask returned. "I don't know what you are to me," he admitted, "but I know that everything's changed." Clara stood, her hands trembling as she stepped closer to him. "It doesn't have to change everything, Alexander. I didn't come here to tear your life apart. I came because I had to know. About you. About me. About her." He turned away, his jaw tight as he stared out the window. "Havenhurst destroyed my family, Clara. Your mother blamed me for what happened, and maybe she was right. I built this empire to bury the past, to forget everything I lost. And now," he turned back to face her, his blue eyes piercing. "Now, you've brought it all back." Clara's voice softened. "I didn't bring it back to hurt you. I brought it back because you're the only family I have left." For days after that conversation, something shifted between them. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed. It became less about avoidance and more about the unspoken connection that now linked them. Alexander began to see Clara not as an intruder, but as someone who had endured her own version of the pain he carried. And Clara for the first time saw Alexander not as the untouchable businessman, but as a man trying to navigate the wreckage of his past. The turning point came on a gray, overcast afternoon. Alexander called Clara into his office without explanation. When she entered, she found him standing beside his desk holding an old photograph. It was worn at the edges, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. A young boy and girl, Alexander and Isabel, smiling in front of the grand Havenhurst estate. "I haven't looked at this in years," Alexander said, his voice low. "I couldn't." Clara stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the photograph. She had never seen her mother that young, that happy. It was almost impossible to reconcile this image with the woman she had known. A woman weighed down by regret and sadness. Alexander handed her the photo. "You wanted the truth. I think it's time you heard it." The drive to Havenhurst was long and silent. Alexander had decided they would go there together, to the place where it all began and where it had all ended. Clara sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city gave way to rolling hills and vast fields. She felt a mix of fear and anticipation. When they finally arrived, Havenhurst loomed before them like a ghost. The once beautiful estate was now a ruin, its grandeur faded by years of neglect. Vines crawled up the walls, windows were shattered, and the gate creaked as Alexander pushed it open. "This is where we grew up," Alexander said as they walked toward the house. "My father built it for us. It was supposed to be a place of joy, a place to keep us safe. But it became something else entirely." Clara followed him inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay lingered. She could almost hear the echoes of the past, laughter, footsteps, doors slamming. "What happened here?" Clara asked softly. Alexander stopped in front of a large fireplace in the main hall, his shoulders slumping as he stared into the darkness. "There was a fire," he said finally. "Isabel and I had been fighting that night. I don't even remember what it was about. She ran upstairs and somehow the fire started. By the time I got to her, it was too late. Clara's heart ached as she listened. She had spent her life wondering why her mother had left Havenhurst, why she had cut ties with everything. Now she understood. She blamed you, Clara said quietly. Alexander nodded, his voice hoarse. She never forgave me, and I never forgave myself. Clara stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. You were just a child, Alexander. It wasn't your fault. He turned to her, his blue eyes filled with anguish. It doesn't matter. I let her down. And when she left, I let you down too. Clara shook her head. No, you didn't know. But you know now. And we have a chance to fix this. To rebuild what was broken. For the first time, Alexander looked at her not with guilt, but with something else. Hope. Over the following weeks, Havenhurst became a symbol not of loss, but of healing. Alexander began the process of restoring the estate, not as a monument to the past, but as a way to honor the family they had lost. Clara became his partner in this effort, working beside him to breathe life back into the forgotten house. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, forged in shared pain but strengthened by their determination to move forward. Clara had come to Knight Industries searching for answers, but she had found something much more valuable, a family and a place to belong. Alexander, for his part, had spent his life building walls to keep people out. But Clara had shown him that some walls were meant to be torn down, and that it was never too late to heal. The restoration of Havenhurst had become more than a project. It was a symbol of redemption for both Alexander and Clara. The once ruined estate slowly began to transform under their efforts. The crumbling walls were repaired, windows replaced, and gardens brought back to life, each new addition breathing fresh hope into a place that had once been a tomb of memories. For Clara, every corner of the house felt like a fragment of her mother's lost childhood. She could almost see Isabel as a young girl running through the gardens or laughing in the grand halls, long before tragedy stole her innocence. For Alexander, Havenhurst represented his chance to face the ghosts he had spent his life avoiding, a place to reconcile with his past and with himself. But healing is never linear, and the past has a way of clawing back when left unresolved. One overcast afternoon, Clara found herself in the east wing of the mansion. The air was musty, the room dimly lit by the faint light filtering through the newly cleaned windows. She had been searching for old documents to help guide the renovation process when she stumbled upon a locked chest at the back of a dusty closet. It was small and unassuming, but something about it sent a chill through her spine. Her fingers trembled as she ran them across the lock. "What are you hiding?" she whispered. After a few moments of effort, Clara managed to pry it open. Inside were yellowed papers, photographs, and letters, each one more revealing than the last. She pulled out a stack of letters bound with twine, her heart pounding as she realized they were addressed to her mother Isabel. The handwriting was unmistakable, Alexander's. Clara sank onto the floor as she began to read. Each letter was filled with words that revealed a side of Alexander she had never known. Letters of regret, of sorrow, and desperate attempts to reconnect with the sister he had lost. "Isabel, I know you blame me for what happened, but please let me make it right. You're the only family I have left. Wherever you are, I will always be your brother." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she flipped through them. The letters spanned years, a testament to the guilt and loneliness that had haunted Alexander since the fire. And then, at the bottom of the chest, she found something else. An official-looking document that made her blood run cold. It was a deed of sale for Havenhurst, dated just weeks after the fire. Clara's hands shook as she read the name on the signature line. Alexander Knight. Beneath it was a clause that suggested something darker, a financial transaction that had forced Isabel to leave, severing all ties to her family. Clara's mind reeled. He sold the estate? He pushed her away? The pieces of the puzzle she had been chasing her whole life suddenly twisted into a new, painful shape. The restoration of Havenhurst, the fragile trust they had built, it all felt like a lie. Clara stormed through the house, her emotions boiling over. She found Alexander in the main hall speaking with a contractor about the final renovations. The sound of her footsteps made him turn, and his expression darkened the moment he saw her face. "Clara?" he asked cautiously. "What's wrong?" She held up the deed, her voice trembling with anger. "You sold Havenhurst." Alexander froze. For the first time, he looked genuinely caught off guard. "Where did you find that?" "Does it matter?" Clara shot back. "You sold the house after the fire. After everything. You forced her to leave." Alexander's face fell, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. He took a step closer, his hands raised as though to calm her. "It's not what you think." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Then what is it, Alexander? Why would you do that? She ran away because of you. Because you pushed her out. And now you're trying to fix it as if none of that matters." Alexander's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words. "I didn't force her to leave," he said quietly. "I sold the estate to protect her." Clara blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about?" Alexander let out a long, shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "After the fire, there was an investigation. My father's business was failing, and Havenhurst was drowning in debt. I didn't have a choice. Selling the house was the only way to cover it. Isabel didn't want to hear it. She was grieving, and she blamed me for everything. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. And then she left." Clara's anger faltered as she took in his words. The pain in his voice was undeniable, and the truth began to take shape in her mind. "You never stopped looking for her," Clara said softly, her voice catching. "That's what the letters were about, weren't they?" Alexander nodded, his eyes shining with unspoken grief. "I wrote to her for years, hoping she'd come back, hoping I could fix what I'd broken, but she never responded. I didn't know she had a child. I didn't know about you, Clara." Clara sank into a nearby chair, the anger replaced by a hollow ache. "She spent her whole life thinking you didn't care. She thought she had no one, and I spent mine thinking I had failed her," Alexander replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. And then you showed up." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. For the first time, the truth had been laid bare between them. Not just about Havenhurst, but about their shared pain, their losses, and the walls they had both built to survive. Days later, Clara found Alexander in the gardens behind Havenhurst, standing near the freshly restored fountain. The air was crisp, and the scent of blooming flowers lingered around them. "You don't have to fix everything," she said quietly, stepping beside him. Alexander glanced at her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "I need to try. For her. For you." Clara looked up at him, her heart full. "You've already done enough, Alexander. My mother might be gone, but you and we still have a chance to make things right." Alexander looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I spent so long believing I didn't deserve a second chance. Maybe I was wrong." Clara smiled faintly, slipping her hand into his. "We both were." The restoration of Havenhurst was completed weeks later. The mansion, once a symbol of tragedy, had become something else entirely. A place of healing, of hope, and of family. On the day of the reopening, Alexander and Clara stood side by side at the entrance, watching as the sun set over the estate. "It's beautiful," Clara murmured. Alexander nodded, his voice steady. "It's a beginning." As the final rays of sunlight bathed Havenhurst in gold, Alexander turned to Clara, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "No more secrets," he said softly. Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. No more secrets. The day of Havenhurst's reopening arrived like a long-awaited dawn. For weeks, the estate had been a hive of activity, with workers restoring the mansion to its former glory. What had once been a decaying monument to grief and loss now stood as a beacon of renewal. The walls had been repaired, the gardens brought back to life, and the halls echoed once again with the sounds of footsteps, sounds that felt like the house was finally breathing again. Clara stood at the front steps of Havenhurst, her heart pounding as she took in the sight. Sunlight streamed through the branches of the ancient oaks that lined the estate's driveway, their leaves casting dappled shadows on the newly cleaned stonework. The grand entrance, once a gateway to memories Clara had never known, now welcomed her as something else entirely. A home. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Alexander. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, the crisp lines softened by the quiet pride on his face. His blue eyes, so often cold and unreadable, were now lighter, as though the weight he carried had been lifted, at least partially. "It's hard to believe it's the same place," Clara said softly, her voice carrying an undertone of wonder. Alexander's gaze swept over the estate, lingering on the intricate carvings of the front door. "It's more than a house now," he replied. "It's a chance to put things right." Clara nodded, but before she could say anything more, cars began pulling up the driveway, the sound of tires crunching against gravel signaling the arrival of their guests. Havenhurst wasn't just reopening for them, it was reopening for the world. Inside the grand hall, the transformation was breathtaking. The chandeliers had been restored to their former brilliance, casting golden light across the polished floors. Tables had been arranged with fresh flowers and crisp white linens, while classical music played softly in the background. The reopening ceremony was a small but significant event, attended by close friends of Alexander, key figures from the restoration project, and members of the community who had been affected by the Knight family's legacy. For Clara, seeing so many people gathered in a place that had once been forgotten felt almost surreal. Alexander moved through the room like a man reborn. He spoke to guests with quiet confidence, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, but his demeanor lacked the aloofness Clara had come to associate with him. He no longer seemed like the untouchable billionaire she had first met. He seemed human. Clara, for her part, found herself at the center of attention more than once. Guests were curious about her, whispering among themselves when they learned she was Isabel Knight's daughter. Some approached her with warm smiles, asking gentle questions about her connection to the estate. Others, perhaps wary of the Knight family's past, regarded her with quiet curiosity. But Clara held her head high, answering each question with poise. She was no longer the young woman hiding her truth in the shadows. She was part of this legacy now, for better or worse. As the ceremony reached its conclusion, Alexander stepped to the center of the room, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. The chatter quieted and all eyes turned toward him. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice carrying through the hall. "For many years, Havenhurst was a symbol of loss and tragedy, both for me and for my family. I spent a long time running from this place, burying the past instead of facing it. I thought that was the only way to survive." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Clara watched him from the edge of the crowd, her chest tight as she listened. "But burying the past doesn't erase it," Alexander continued. "It doesn't heal what's broken. It was Clara who reminded me of that, who brought me back to this place and forced me to face what I'd tried so hard to forget." He paused, his gaze finding Clara across the room. For a moment, it felt as though they were the only two people there. "This house was once my home, and it will be again," he said. "But more than that, I want it to be a place where healing happens, a place where the future isn't defined by the mistakes of the past." The guests erupted into quiet applause, but Clara barely heard it. Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. For so long, Alexander had been trapped in the shadows of his past, but now he was finally stepping into the light. As the evening wore on and the guests began to leave, Clara found herself wandering through the mansion's halls, taking in the details of each room. In the study, the shelves had been restocked with leather-bound books, their spines gleaming in the lamplight. In the sitting room, a fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold emptiness she had felt when she first set foot in the house. She stopped in front of a large portrait hanging above the mantel. It was a new addition, a painting of Isabel, young and smiling, standing beside Alexander. The artist had captured the light in her eyes perfectly, the same light Clara saw whenever she looked in the mirror. "I thought it was time she came home," Alexander's voice said softly from behind her. Clara turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. He looked at the portrait with a mix of sadness and peace. "She would have liked this," Clara said. Alexander nodded. "She deserved to be remembered. And you deserve to be here." Clara smiled, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander stepped closer, his expression earnest. "You brought me back to this place, Clara. You reminded me of who I was, of who I could be. I don't know how to repay that." "You don't have to," she replied. "You already did." Later that night, as the house grew quiet and the last of the staff finished cleaning up, Clara and Alexander stood together on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The moon cast a soft, silver glow over the landscape, illuminating the newly planted flowers and the restored fountain. "It's beautiful," Clara said, her voice filled with awe. Alexander nodded, his gaze distant but content. "It's a start." Clara turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "So what now?" Alexander looked at her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Now, we build something new. Together." The words hung in the air between them, filled with promise. For the first time in years, Havenhurst was not a place of ghosts and regrets. It was a place of hope. As they stood together under the moonlight, Clara realized that the home she had been searching for wasn't just a house or a name. It was here, with Alexander, in the fragile bond they had built from the ashes of the past. And for Alexander, the man who had spent his life in solitude, Clara was the family he had thought he'd lost forever. The sun rose gently over Havenhurst on a morning bathed in golden light. The estate, once a symbol of grief and loss, now stood proudly against the backdrop of rolling hills and blooming gardens, alive with a renewed sense of purpose. Clara stood at the edge of the garden, breathing in the crisp, fresh air. The scent of lilacs and morning dew lingered, carried on a soft breeze. Havenhurst had become a home, not just to her, but to the memories of the past and the possibilities of the future. A soft voice pulled her out of her reverie. "Admiring your work?" She turned to find Alexander standing nearby, a faint smile on his lips. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, dark slacks and a soft navy sweater, the edges of his shirt sleeves peeking out. The transformation he had undergone over the past few months was visible in everything. The way he stood, his lighter expression, and the way his blue eyes no longer carried the weight of the world. "I guess I am," Clara said with a smile. "Hard to believe this is the same place." Alexander stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over the garden that was now alive with vibrant colors. "It's more than just the house that changed." Clara looked at him, her heart full. She knew he wasn't talking about the estate anymore. They had both been transformed, each in their own way. Two people who had started this journey as strangers and had now become something far more. Months had passed since the day of Havenhurst's reopening. In that time, the estate had blossomed into more than just a restored mansion. It had become a symbol of healing, legacy, and hope. Alexander had opened the doors of Havenhurst to the community, establishing it as a retreat for families in need, artists seeking inspiration, and those searching for solace. The grand halls that had once been silent now echoed with laughter, conversation, and music. It was a place where the weight of the past could be released and replaced with a sense of peace. The Havenhurst Foundation, as Alexander had named it, was Clara's idea. She had approached him with the proposal not long after the ceremony, her voice trembling with excitement as she explained how the estate could serve as a safe haven for others, the way it had for them. "You're always looking for ways to help people," Alexander had said at the time, shaking his head in quiet amazement. "Where did you learn that?" "From my mother," Clara had replied softly, "and maybe a little from you." On a crisp spring afternoon, the estate was alive with activity. Children played on the freshly mowed lawns, their laughter carrying across the gardens. Artists painted on easels set beneath the sprawling oaks, capturing the mansion's new life in vivid colors. Families gathered for picnics, their voices mingling with the hum of bees and the distant sound of a fountain bubbling. Clara walked through the grounds with a sense of pride she had never known before. Everywhere she looked, she saw proof of what she and Alexander had built together. Not just the physical restoration of the estate, but the emotional transformation it had brought them both. As she made her way toward the main house, she spotted Alexander standing near the fountain, speaking with a group of visitors. His posture was relaxed, his smile genuine, something she had rarely seen when they first met. He was no longer the cold, isolated man hiding behind walls of stone and silence. He had become a man who embraced life and connection, finding purpose beyond his empire. Alexander looked up as Clara approached, his smile widening. "You're late," he teased lightly. "Late for what?" Clara shot back, raising an eyebrow. "For the future," he replied with mock seriousness, though his eyes betrayed the warmth behind his words. Clara laughed, shaking her head. "Well, I'm here now. And that's what matters," Alexander said softly, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Alexander and Clara stood side by side on the balcony overlooking the estate. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the light reflecting off the newly restored mansion. It was a scene of tranquility, of closure, and of new beginnings. Clara turned to Alexander, her voice quiet. "Did you ever think it would end up like this?" He shook his head, his expression contemplative. "No. For a long time I thought the past would always define me. That Havenhurst would always be a reminder of what I'd lost." "And now?" she asked gently. Alexander smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. "Now it's a reminder of what I've gained." Clara's heart swelled at his words. She knew what he meant. They had both come to Havenhurst searching for answers, Alexander for redemption, and Clara for the truth about her past. Instead, they had found each other. "You brought me back to life, Clara," Alexander said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "I spent years building walls to keep people out. But you broke through them, and I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Clara looked at him, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. "You gave me a family, Alexander. I spent my whole life thinking I was alone. But you showed me that I wasn't. That I never was." He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but steady. "We're not alone anymore. And we never will be." The two of them stood together as the last light of day faded into twilight, the gardens below illuminated by soft lanterns. For the first time, Havenhurst wasn't a place of sorrow. It was a home for them both. As the years passed, Havenhurst continued to thrive, becoming a sanctuary for countless people seeking comfort and hope. Alexander and Clara worked side by side to grow the Havenhurst Foundation, dedicating their lives to helping others heal the way they had healed. Clara's story, once defined by loss and longing, became a testament to resilience, love, and the power of forgiveness. And Alexander, who had spent so much of his life in isolation, found that family wasn't just something you were born into. It was something you built. Together, they proved that even the most broken places could be restored, that even the deepest wounds could heal, and that love in all its forms could turn the darkest chapters of our lives into something beautiful.